Hi, my name is Theresa Bouley, and I'm a professor of education at Eastern Connecticut State University. Before I was a teacher educator, I was a classroom teacher teaching grades 1st through 4th. And my passion since then has been in social justice education. Issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion in early child and elementary education are just really important to me. So I'm always telling my in-service and pre-service teachers that they, as early childhood educators or elementary educators, are in the ideal position to support their students' understanding of difference, of diversity, their students' awareness of differences, their students' comfort level with differences. In early childhood education and elementary education, we work with students who have a really strong sense of empathy. Young children are empathetic. They understand how it might feel to have your feelings hurt. And they have a really strong sense of social justice. They understand fairness. It's not fair that you have 2 pieces of that and I have 1. It's not fair that you are going to bring her to your birthday party but I can't go. Children have a really natural, strong sense of empathy and social justice, fairness, equity, inclusion, all of these elements that we talk about and think about when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, or multicultural education. So the early childhood educator, the elementary educator, has a lot of power and has to understand that a big part of their role as teachers is to help their students to develop their understandings and awareness in these areas so they could grow up to be members of a very pluralistic society. So early childhood and elementary teachers should be able to do this by creating safe classroom environments. And a big part of that classroom environment is inclusion and equity, making sure that all types of diversity, students of color, ethnic, cultural diversity, ability diversity, linguistic diversity, economic diversity, family diversity, all different types of diversity, gender identity, expression diversity, are present in their classrooms. And that needs to be pervasive. It needs to be through their classroom materials, the children's books that they read, if you're teaching preschool or kindergarten, maybe the dolls, the family bulletin boards, the symbolic curriculum on the walls, who's on the walls, in what positions are they on the walls, are there women on the walls in power positions, are there all different people of color on the walls or people with different abilities on the walls, are the words on the walls multilingual? So early childhood and elementary teachers first need to establish that kind of inclusive environment where all students feel safe and all students see themselves represented, all students see their families and their identities affirmed in these classrooms. And a big part of that is not just the classroom materials, the walls, the writing on the walls, the bulletin boards, but it's the language. I'm always telling my students that I think the most important part of the day is the teacher-student interaction. And in early child and elementary education, we also have a lot of interactions with our families. So the teacher-family interaction is equally important. So I often say words matter. Words matter a lot. So when we think about our conversations, our interactions with our students, we have to think about what words we're using. And this is a big part of inclusion, of diversity, and affirmation of diversity in our classroom. So teachers need to think about when they're talking to children, are they saying boys and girls, line up over here? Are they saying give this to your mom and dad? Are they saying why didn't you get your homework done last night? Did your mom help you? And these interactions will be counterproductive in the sense that what's really important for us is to develop positive relationships with our students and their families. And these interactions sometimes come off as feeling like microaggressions. And so when I talk about microaggressions and implicit bias and microaggressions as a language of implicit bias with my students, pre-service or in-service students, I'm talking to them about how important it is to remember that microaggressions are not about the intent, but about the impact. And one of the things we have to do as educators is get to know our students really well and get to know their families so that we can use that information to differentiate our interactions with students and with their families, so that we know that this particular child has two moms, and we might say, bring this home to your moms. Or we know that this particular child is living with grandma, and so we might be careful to not ask them to do a family tree, or we might not assign a homework on a religious holiday that's not a mainstream religious holiday. All of these experiences are often experienced by children, and some children more than others, as microaggressions. So when I'm thinking about and talking about multicultural education and how to create inclusive classrooms in early childhood and elementary schools, I think the first step is teacher self-awareness. So teachers need to be aware, and not just aware of their students, as I just mentioned, but also aware of themselves, aware of their own biases, aware of the socio-political or familial context in which they grew up, knowing how that context has impacted them, knowing what biases or beliefs they might have or what assumptions they might be making about their students and families. So when teachers are aware, they're constantly reflective. They might tape record themselves teaching to listen to how they might give one child more wait time than another child, or they might call on boys more during math and girls more during reading, or they might be making the assumption that a child who is having a difficult time, maybe he's growing up in a single mom family, is not capable of understanding certain materials, so they lower their expectations. All of these are experienced by students as microaggressions. And so when teachers don't analyze their implicit bias or are aware of their bias, there's a lot of potential for our classroom interactions with both our students and our families and our colleagues, for that matter, to come off as microaggressions. So teachers stopping and thinking about and listening to their language, thinking about being open and vulnerable about their own biases, thinking about where they might come from, thinking about the assumptions they might be making, thinking about how students might be experiencing some of the comments or some of the assignments or some of the things that they might be doing, are really important for teachers to do. I always say that self-awareness is the first step in the road of being a multicultural educator. And implicit bias is something that we all have, and we have to be aware and thinking about how that might be transmitted to the students in our classrooms and their families. So one of the things that I think we need to be really careful to do, again, is think about our language, think about making sure that we're differentiating our language using what we know about our students, and also thinking about ways that we might address student microaggressions. I think it's really important for teachers to recognize that they cannot be bystanders, but they need to be allies. And in some moments when something happens, maybe a child says something to another child like, you can't come to my party because you don't have nice sneakers and you don't have nice clothes, and I don't think you're going to give me a nice present. A teacher needs to stop and ask, what do you mean when you say that? And how do you feel when he just said that to you? How do you feel now? One person in early childhood education that really influenced me was T. Barry Brazelton. And one of the things that T. Barry Brazelton, the pediatrician, talked about was how he worried as much about the biter as he did the child who was bitten. And when children, students, and in early childhood elementary, we're talking about children, when they see that the words they used or their behaviors caused another child to feel bad, they don't feel good about themselves. And so many times children don't understand what they're saying when they might use a term. Recently I had a student in one of my classes say a child said to another child, you can't come to my party because you're mixed race. And this child clearly didn't understand what he was saying, but heard this from someone in his life. So one of the things we do is stop and back up and say, what do you mean when you say mixed race? What do you mean when you say he can't come to your party because he's mixed race? And how does it feel to you to be told that? And how can we work through this? Because one of the things we want to avoid is shame. And I'm a huge fan of Brene Brown and her work around vulnerability and shame. And I believe that when we are punitive and we don't ask children what they mean or don't give them opportunity to explain themselves or to understand and see the reactions or the consequences of their behavior, they develop a sense of shame. And when students experience that shame, or when students experience microaggressions, it has a negative impact on their development, their identity, their family identity, whether that's their language, their speak, or the color of their skin, or the way in which they express their gender. They start to develop a sense of shame around these really important parts of their identity. And when that happens, it not only has a big impact on their social emotional development and who they develop to be as people, but also their learning. So implicit bias or microaggressions has a huge impact on children's ability to learn content. What we know about brain research is that the brain shuts down when we perceive a threat. So children go into this period of downshifting where it makes it almost impossible to learn the material that's being presented to them. So microaggressions, whether it's student-to-student microaggression or teacher-to-teacher microaggression, again, keeping in mind that it's not about the intent but the impact, can have a negative impact on children's affect, on their social emotional development, on their cognitive development, and overall on their ability to feel good about themselves. And that ability to feel good about themselves is what I think is the most important job of the early childhood and elementary teacher.